So one of the questions Brad and I get frequently, both from prospective consultants, from new consultants, and sometimes even from people who've been around for a while, are what are the marks of a good Generis consultant? And it's an interesting question because there's some science to it, but there's a lot of art to it. I think in a lot of cases, sometimes Brad and I have to fight the temptation to override a first impression. Sometimes your first impression is really, really strong, and you have to kind of suppress that and say, wait a minute, let's make sure we carefully examine all the things that matter here, and I'll talk about some of those things in a minute. Sometimes, and there's actually an example of it here in the room, there's a person who it doesn't click right away, but then there's a point where it does click. And so that's why you have to be really careful when you start getting to know people and when you're looking at people. Greg Morris is that person. Greg and I were having a conversation, and I just wasn't feeling it with Greg. And there was a point in the conversation where we got to a certain kind of conversation piece about it when I was talking to Greg, and it just clicked. And so all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, yeah, I think this does work. And of course, you all know Greg is now, one of our very, very top tier, very successful consultants. But, for Greg and me sitting in my office for 30 minutes or so, I was just wondering whether it was going to work or not. And so we have to be careful about that. Not to let a first impression, not to fall in love with a first impression, not to let the first impression dissuade you, because there are some things that are pretty common. We vet everyone, as you all know, for this idea of personal calling. Alan Wiles is a real good example of that. Alan had no experience. He had been in a church where we'd done a couple of campaigns, and he just felt like God was calling him to do this. And some of you all know the story. His story is kind of like the parable of the persistent widow. He kept knocking on the door, and I finally let him in just so he'd stop knocking. But I said to him, let's give this 6 months. And I think if God is behind this with you, we'll know it in 6 months or so. And he's been here almost 20 years now. It was pretty clear that God wanted Alan to move into this work, even though when it came to credentials, I didn't see it at the time. And so this idea of personal calling, part of how we test that is, we talked about that in the values proposition, is we want to know that you have a valid testimony of faith in Christ. We want to know that you're actively involved in a local church. We want to know that you have a giving story. We kind of test it through that. And the idea of personal calling. That's where Brad talked about this idea of this person who was coming to us from this other firm never verbalized his affiliation with that firm or with Generis as personal calling. It was just about vocational success, and he was pretty good at it. And as soon as we put him into the advisory council, I think Brad and I knew that he probably wouldn't make it through the gauntlet, but we thought, just because of his credentials, let's see if he does, and didn't. And so personal calling, this idea of personal calling is very important to us. Commitment to the local church, as we said, a big part of that. Knows the church space well. Increasingly, I think that is a factor. When Alan Wiles came on, it was a factor, but it wasn't really as big as it is today. I think people, when we put somebody into a church, you're expected to know how to navigate the church space, either as a very, very active layperson or as a staff person, or having been a staff person. And so we're always looking for that. It's really hard for a person to be able to plug in and not have known the church space well. Occasionally we'll get somebody and maybe we're thinking that person probably belongs more on the NPO side, because they know the NPO side better, and maybe they can get to know the church side. So, there's some leeway there. But knowing the church space well, because it helps you to navigate. I think this is one of the factors that is very, very helpful for anybody who is going to be successful. A good personal network of people in the church space. Advocates, evangelists, people who can say good things about you. For some of you, it might be clients. For some of it might be ministry friends. For some of you, it might be some combination of the above. Clients over the years, ministry friends, people like that. But I think it's helpful when you have a good personal network. We have people who come that don't have a great network and then develop a good network through that. Obviously, our marketing is going to try to help feed you and put some of some business on the books for you, but as we say over and over again, Brad says it I think best. You're responsible for your personal success. We're going to help with that as we can. And increasingly we're doing more and more of that with our marketing. I think it's really important to understand how we look through this. And one of the tools we use now is the right path. I think everybody in this room has taken a right path examination. Either you had one before you came to us, some of you did, and or we right passed you on the way in. For some of the other ones, we right passed you, and I'll speak about that in a minute, and got a benchmark out of it. For many years, we had an interview with an industrial psychologist as a part of our process. And Herman, I think you remember Roy Austin, Alan Weiss. Alan survived that interview. Still here to talk about it. You should at some point in time you should ask Julie about her interview with Roy Austin. Just ask her. Make sure you've got an hour, because it's a robust conversation. But it just came to a point where that wasn't getting us the kind of screening that we were really looking for. We had what we thought was a fairly obvious screening mistake, and we had somebody to slip through. Now, fortunately, we caught it pretty quickly and were able to correct it. But we had one that really kind of sent us on a pathway of finding some other things. Well, there's a guy, in fact, he's a member of my church. This is my church right here that we're at, Perimeter. Jerry Mabe. Jerry started didn't even remember the personal calling thing that Larry Burkett had back in the day in Christian Financial Concepts. I forget what he called it. Dave Travis, do you remember what he called it? But it was a test that you went through and kind of its wiring and calling and this. Well, that was Jerry's diagnostic. And he started a firm that does it now, and it's the right path screening. And really what it does is it tells us how you're wired and how you work. Inside of Generis, there are probably about 4 main profiles. I'm not going to take the time to go through what those are, but Brad and I are very different profiles. Most of the people in the firm have either a profile like Brad or a profile like me. And there's 2 primary variants on Brad's profile. There's 2 primary variants on my profile. Not to go into that, but you'll see that throughout. Well, I don't think that's an accident. Brad and I have both been pretty successful at this, and the people who, and by the way, we don't use that as a disqualifier, but it tells us a lot up front because we can see inside of how you work. If we see someone who is extremely disorganized, it's not a disqualifier, it's just that we know on the right path, you're wired that way. You're going to have to figure out a way around that, or you're just going to be a mess in front of your clients and you won't be successful. Everybody see that? Just to pick out one characteristic. But what we did several years ago was we said to Right Path, what would happen if we gave you everybody in the firm at the time? And not everybody had been Right Path. So somebody like an Alan Wiles had not done a Right Path. He came through the Roy Austin era. So we went back and we Right Pathed everybody we didn't have a Right Path on. And we told the Right Path people who our most successful consultants were. And they've created for us what we call the benchmark. Now, there's quite a few factors inside the benchmark. And again, not any one of them is a disqualifier. It's just that we have to know if we see something, it's a flag, we have to talk you through it and say, if you've had experience as a consultant, how have you worked around this? Or if you've not had experience as a consultant, we would say, hey, Jim, your profile is showing that you have, a preponderance of issues that look kind of, disorganized. How are you going to fix that and make sure that you come across well in a client? But the big 3 are right here. And if you go back to your Right Path, you can see what they are. They're sub-factors. There's a sub-factor called achieving. There's a sub-factor called assertive. And there's a sub-factor called ambition. And together, the composite score of those 3 is called the drive factor. And what we have found is the drive factor is really the one thing that our most successful people had in common. Some of them were more introverted. Some of them were more extroverted. Some of them were more organized, like a Rusty Lewis. Some of them were, more challenged in that area. Some people were more, compassionate. Some people were a little higher on the blunt scale. Present company, maybe. We had people at all over the place, but when we looked at our most successful people, that was what really stood out for us. So when Brad and Don and I look at, prospective candidates, we're looking for that because we know our most successful people had a drive score of 56 or higher. 56 or higher. Could have a 52, a 54. Somebody recently had a 63, which is about the highest we've ever seen. I'm trying to remember who that was. But it's very, very helpful for us because that's how you're wired. And so it helps us to help you to know who's been successful here and how you could be one of those. I think that's really important for people who come here to have an entrepreneurial mindset with a high commitment to personal success. You have to wake up in the morning and decide, if I'm going to be successful, it is up to me. And the drive factor tells us a lot of that. But you have to be okay with the fact that your income is going to be variable. We had a very notable, as Dave Ramsey says, in the hiring process, we had 3 screening criteria originally. The other 4 have names on them. That'd be a good place for a laugh track, right? Everybody know what I'm saying? Because then somebody gets through the other criteria and you have a name on them. Well, we had a guy come through, no need to add his name, but I think anybody who was here knows who I'm talking about, who came through, who had been with RSI on their payroll model, the W-2 model. We brought him over here. He was scared to death. Couldn't handle it. He couldn't handle it. He was more, and it was gifted. If he had stuck it out, he could have been as good as he wanted to be. He was very good as a consultant, related to churches and everything, but he was nervous about it, and as a result, guess who else was nervous, even more so than he was? His wife. And when the spouse is not behind you guys, it's really hard to make this work because there's going to be ups and downs. I probably don't give enough credit to Nancy for being kind of, the stability back in 1992, 93 when I was getting started, when she said, honey, if God's behind this, it's going to work for you. It's okay. Or when I've recently, even more recently, when I've lost a significant contract, $80,000, $90,000, and I can tell Nancy, and she's like, okay, God didn't mean for you to be there. He's got something else in store for you. You've got to have a spouse that's very supportive because it's going to be up and down. You're going to have times when it doesn't work. There are times when she kind of looked at 2009 when another contract canceled. She said, okay, I was okay with the first one. The second one I got, it was okay. The third one, I'm starting to get a little nervous. Anybody who was in this work in 2009 knows what I was talking about. It's a little tough. But the entrepreneurial mindset, you have to be okay with the fact I don't have a guaranteed paycheck. Guys, I was 20 years, 18 years in the corporate world. I thought security was direct deposit from a Fortune 500 company on a semi-monthly basis until June of 1992 when they clipped the rope, right? And what I've realized is I really have a lot more security in being my own boss. But I'm committed to my own personal success. Even now, I'm committed. For Brad and me, as long as we still have to make our primary income from consultants, we have to live like that. We have to wake up and decide, I am committed to my personal success in a way that, benefits me. So those are marks. There's a lot of other stuff that you could say in terms of that, but I think we just had to distill it to a few things. Those are the marks of successful Generis consultants on those 2 slides.